January 15, 1945. The thermometer outside Major Robert Hayes's office at Camp Carson, Colorado, read 12 degrees below zero. Inside the drafty administrative building, he stared at a telegram that had arrived that morning from the War Department's Supply Division. Due to critical fuel shortages across the Western Theater, coal deliveries to non-essential facilities would be suspended indefinitely. The words "non-essential" felt like a cruel joke when applied to a prisoner of war camp housing 63 German women in the middle of a Rocky Mountain winter. Major Hayes had commanded the facility for 8 months, ever since the first transport of German Women's Auxiliary Corps members arrived from the European theater. Unlike the massive POW compounds scattered across Texas and the Deep South, Camp Carson was a hastily converted civilian conservation corps site, chosen precisely because its remote location made escape nearly impossible. The mountains themselves were the real walls. But those same mountains also made the camp dependent on a single supply route that wound through treacherous passes, and that route had just been cut. He walked to the window and looked out at the compound. The German women moved between buildings in tight groups, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. They wore a mixture of their original gray auxiliary uniforms layered under whatever additional clothing the Red Cross had provided. Most had never experienced cold like this. Dresden, Stuttgart, Cologne, the cities listed on their intake forms might have winter, but nothing like the bone-deep freeze of the Colorado high country. The camp's coal supply would last perhaps another week if they were careful. After that, the women would be confined to a single heated building, packed together like refugees, which technically they were. Hayes had already sent urgent requests up the chain of command, but he knew how military bureaucracy worked. By the time Washington approved emergency measures, his prisoners might already be suffering from frostbite or worse. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Mitchell entered, snow dusting his shoulders. "Sir, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is William Mackenzie, local rancher. He heard about our situation." Hayes frowned. News traveled fast in small mountain communities, but he hadn't expected civilians to involve themselves in military matters, especially concerning enemy prisoners. "Send him in." The man who entered looked like he'd stepped out of a frontier photograph. William Mackenzie stood well over 6 feet tall, his weathered face mapped with lines that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore a sheepskin coat and boots that had seen countless winters. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent despite his age. "Major Hayes," Mackenzie said, his voice carrying a slight Scottish burr. "Heard your coal trucks aren't coming. Figured you might need some local knowledge about how we keep warm out here when the supplies don't arrive." He paused, meeting the major's eyes directly. "We burn sagebrush, and I know every stand of it within 20 miles of this camp." Katrin Schroeder stood at the barracks window, watching snow accumulate on the distant peaks. At 24 years old, she had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing she would serve Germany from behind a radio desk in Berlin or perhaps Vienna. Instead, she had been captured in France during the chaotic retreat of 1944 and shipped across an ocean to this frozen wilderness that felt like the edge of the world. She pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The coal-fired stove at the center of their barracks provided barely enough heat to keep the water in their washing buckets from freezing solid overnight. And now, according to whispered conversations among the guards, even that meager warmth would soon disappear. "Kat, come away from the window," Ingrid Bauer called from her bunk. At 22, Ingrid had served as a medical assistant with a Wehrmacht field hospital before her capture. She possessed a practical nature that Katrin envied. "Staring at the snow won't make it warmer in here." "I'm trying to understand this place," Katrin replied in German. "In Dresden, winter was cold but civilized. We had cafes and heated buildings and coal deliveries that actually arrived. Here, it feels like we've been sent to Siberia." Helene Richter, the youngest of their group at 20 years old, sat on her bunk attempting to darn a sock with thread she'd bartered from one of the guards. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or nervousness, Katrin couldn't tell. Helene had been a supply clerk in Cologne, shuffling papers in a warm office. Nothing in her previous life had prepared her for this. "I heard Elsa talking to the guards," Helene said quietly. She speaks better English than most of us. The coal isn't coming. They're going to move us all into the mess hall and try to keep just that one building heated. Katrin turned from the window. Elsa Wagner, at 32, was one of the older prisoners and had quickly become an informal leader among the German women. If she was concerned enough to question the guards directly, the situation was worse than Katrin had imagined. "How long can they keep even one building warm?" Ingrid asked, her practical mind already calculating their odds. "Maybe a week," Katrin said. "Then what? Do they expect us to simply freeze while Washington decides whether enemy prisoners are worth the fuel?" The question hung in the cold air between them. They had been treated relatively well since their arrival, certainly better than they had expected based on German propaganda about American cruelty. The guards were distant but not unkind. The food was plain but adequate. Major Hayes ran the camp with firm efficiency, tempered by unexpected moments of consideration for their circumstances. But none of that would matter if the temperature continued to drop and the coal ran out. The next morning, Katrin and the other women were assembled in the mess hall. Major Hayes stood before them, his expression carefully neutral. Beside him stood 3 men who looked nothing like the young soldiers who typically guarded the camp. These were older, weathered men dressed in heavy wool and leather, their faces carved by wind and sun into masks of permanent squint lines and deep creases. "Ladies," Major Hayes began, and Katrin appreciated that he always used that term rather than prisoners. "Our coal supply situation remains critical. However, we have been offered assistance by members of the local ranching community. These gentlemen have experience surviving Rocky Mountain winters without conventional fuel sources. They've agreed to teach you an alternative method of heating." The tallest of the 3 men stepped forward. His age showed in the silver of his hair and beard, but his posture remained straight and strong. "Name's William Mackenzie," he said slowly, clearly aware that many of them struggled with English. "Most folks call me Bill. This here is my nephew David, and that's Charlie Brennan. We ranch about 15 miles north of here." Katrin studied the 3 Americans with confusion. These weren't soldiers or bureaucrats. They looked like characters from the Western films she'd seen before the war, men who seemed to belong to a different century entirely. David Mackenzie appeared closer to her own age, around 30, with his uncle's height but darker hair. Charlie Brennan was younger still, perhaps 26, with a lean build and observant eyes. "We're going to teach you about sagebrush," Bill continued. "It's a plant that grows all over these mountains, burns hot and fast when it's dry. Won't keep you warm all night like coal, but if you know how to gather it and use it right, it'll keep you from freezing." Elsa Wagner raised her hand, speaking in her careful English. "You want us to gather plants? Like peasants?" Bill's weathered face creased into something that might have been amusement. "Ma'am, out here in winter, everyone's a peasant. Rich, poor, American, German, doesn't matter. Coal doesn't care about your politics. It just cares whether you're smart enough to stay alive." Ingrid leaned close to Katrin and whispered in German, "Are they serious? They want us to go out in this weather and pick weeds?" Major Hayes cleared his throat. "I understand this is unconventional, but our options are limited. The coal we have left will be reserved for the medical facility and for emergency use. The rest of the camp will need to rely on alternative heating sources. Mr. Mackenzie and his associates have volunteered their time to teach you the necessary skills." Katrin watched as several of the German women exchanged glances of disbelief and barely concealed disdain. They had been soldiers of the Reich, trained, and professionals serving their country. Now they were being instructed in survival techniques by frontier cowboys who looked like they'd stepped out of history. The first lesson began that afternoon. Bill Mackenzie led a group of 20 women, including Katrin, Ingrid, and Helene, out beyond the camp's perimeter fence. 2 guards accompanied them, more out of protocol than any real concern that the prisoners would flee into the frozen wilderness. Where would they go? The landscape stretched before them in shades of white and gray, broken only by patches of silvery green vegetation that clung stubbornly to the frozen earth. Bill stopped at a large, gnarled bush and gestured for the women to gather around. His breath formed clouds in the air as he spoke. "This here's big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata if you want the fancy name. grows all over the high desert and mountain valleys. The old-timers, the native tribes, they've been burning this for thousands of years. He broke off a branch, showing them the twisted, aromatic wood beneath the silver-green leaves. You want the older growth, the woody stuff. This here's perfect. Katrin knelt in the snow beside the plant, her fingers already numb despite her gloves. The branch Bill had broken released a sharp, medicinal scent that reminded her vaguely of the herbs her grandmother used to keep in sachets. She tried to break off a similar piece and found the wood tougher than it looked. You need to twist and pull, David Mackenzie demonstrated, moving through the group to help individual women. Not just yank, the plant's got give to it if you work with it instead of against it. Helene struggled with a particularly stubborn branch, her face flushed with effort and cold. Charlie Brennan appeared at her side, his movements patient and unhurried. Here, miss. See how it grows? You want to find where the old wood meets the new. That's your weak point. He guided her hands to the right spot, and the branch came free with a satisfying crack. Helene looked up at him with surprise, murmuring a quiet danke before remembering herself and adding, "Thank you." For 2 hours they worked, filling burlap sacks with sagebrush, while the 3 ranchers moved among them, correcting techniques and offering encouragement. Katrin found herself falling into a rhythm, her hands learning the feel of the right branches, her eyes beginning to distinguish between the woody growth worth gathering and the green shoots that wouldn't burn well. Ingrid worked beside her, methodical as always. "This is absurd," she muttered in German. "We're trained professionals reduced to gathering firewood like medieval peasants." But Katrin noticed something in her friend's voice that contradicted the words. There was almost a note of satisfaction in it. For months they had been idle prisoners, their days marked only by meals and roll calls and the slow passage of empty hours. This work, strange and humbling as it was, gave them purpose. That evening, Bill Mackenzie built the first sagebrush fire in a metal barrel outside the main barracks. The German women gathered around as he arranged the twisted branches with the care of an artist composing a painting. He crumpled some dry grass and inner bark for tinder, then struck a match. The sagebrush caught quickly, flames leaping up with a sharp crackling sound. The scent that filled the air was unlike anything Katrin had smelled before, sharp and clean and somehow wild. The fire burned hot and bright, throwing dancing shadows across the snow. Within minutes, she could feel genuine warmth on her face and hands. "Burns faster than coal," Bill explained, his weathered face illuminated by the flames. "You'll need to feed it regular, every 20 minutes or so, but it's free. And there's enough sagebrush in these mountains to keep you warm till spring if you're willing to work for it." David Mackenzie appeared with a battered coffee pot and a collection of tin cups. "Figured you ladies might appreciate something hot." His English was slower than his uncle's, carefully pronounced for their benefit. He poured dark coffee, passing cups to the nearest women. Katrin accepted hers with both hands, grateful for the warmth. The coffee was stronger and more bitter than anything she'd had in Germany, but she found she didn't mind. Ingrid stood beside her, sipping carefully, while Helene had moved closer to the fire, her young face finally relaxed from its usual expression of worried tension. "In Scotland, where my father came from," Bill said, settling onto a log someone had dragged near the fire, "we burned peat. Different fuel, same principle. You use what the land gives you." He looked around at the circle of German faces watching him. "I imagine some of you come from cities. This kind of living must seem pretty strange." "I am from Dresden," Katrin said carefully, testing her English. The words felt clumsy in her mouth compared to the fluid German she thought in. "Big city, many buildings, many people. This," she gestured at the vast darkness beyond their small circle of firelight, "is very different." "Dresden," Bill repeated thoughtfully. "I hear that's a beautiful city. Old churches and such." Katrin's throat tightened. She had heard rumors about what had happened to Dresden in the recent bombing raids, though details were scarce and often contradictory. She didn't know if her family's apartment building still stood, if her parents and younger brother had survived. Letters from home had stopped arriving months ago. "Yes," she managed. "Very beautiful." An awkward silence fell, broken only by the crackle of burning sagebrush. Then Elsa Wagner, who had been standing at the edge of the circle, spoke up in her better English. "Mr. Mackenzie, how long you ranch here?" 42 years. Bill replied, seemingly grateful for the change of subject. "Came out here as a young man with my brother. The land's hard, but it's honest. Tells you the truth about yourself pretty quick." The storm arrived 3 days later with a ferocity that stunned even the local ranchers. What began as light snow at dawn transformed by midday into a wall of white that erased the world beyond 20 feet. Wind howled through the camp, driving snow into drifts that buried the lower windows of the barracks and turned the paths between buildings into treacherous channels of ice. Major Hayes made the decision quickly. All prisoners would shelter in the mess hall, the only building large enough to accommodate everyone and still maintain a safe fire. The German women moved through the blizzard in small groups, guards guiding them with ropes strung between buildings to prevent anyone from becoming disoriented in the whiteout conditions. Bill Mackenzie and his nephew David had been checking fence lines on the northern edge of the camp property when the storm intensified. Charlie Brennan had left earlier that morning to return to his own ranch. Now Bill and David found themselves cut off from their truck, forced to take shelter in the camp rather than risk the 15-mile journey home through conditions that could kill a man in minutes. Inside the mess hall, Katrin helped arrange blankets and sleeping spaces, while Ingrid assisted the camp nurse in setting up a medical station in case of emergencies. The building was crowded with 63 German women, a dozen guards, Major Hayes, and now 2 unexpected civilian guests. The large sagebrush fire Bill had built in the kitchen's secondary stove provided heat, but feeding it required a constant rotation of women making quick trips to the fuel shed. By evening, the temperature outside had dropped to 30 below zero. The wind shook the building's walls and found every crack and gap in the old construction. Women huddled in groups, sharing blankets and body warmth. Some prayed quietly, others simply stared at the fire, their faces reflecting its orange glow. "I've seen bad storms," Bill said to Major Hayes, both men standing near the stove. "But this is shaping up to be one for the record books. We might be stuck here a couple days." Katrin overheard the conversation from where she sat with Ingrid and Helene. 2 days trapped in this crowded building with dwindling food supplies and a fire that needed constant feeding. She volunteered for the next fuel run, pulling on every layer of clothing she owned before pushing out into the screaming wind. The fuel shed was only 40 feet from the mess hall, but the journey felt like miles. Snow stung her face like thrown sand. She could barely see the rope guide in her gloved hands. She filled her arms with sagebrush and turned back, following the rope with desperate concentration. Halfway back, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A voice, calling out weakly. She stopped, straining to hear over the wind. There it was again, off to her left, beyond the rope line. Katrin knew the rules. Stay on the rope line, never deviate in a blizzard. But that voice called out again, weaker this time, and she recognized something in it. She secured her armload of sagebrush at the base of the rope, then moved carefully toward the sound, keeping one hand trailing back to maintain contact with her only lifeline. She found David Mackenzie collapsed against the side of the barracks, half buried in a snowdrift. He had gone out to check the animals in the camp's small stable and had become disoriented on the return journey. His lips were blue, his speech slurred from the cold. Katrin didn't think. She simply acted. Using techniques she had learned during her auxiliary training, she got his arm around her shoulders and half dragged, half carried him back toward the rope line. He was significantly larger than her, and the effort left her gasping. But she found the rope, found her abandoned bundle of sagebrush, and somehow got both the fuel and the freezing man back to the mess hall door. Ingrid took charge, the moment they stumbled inside. Her medical training came flooding back as she ordered David moved close to the fire, called for blankets, and began checking his extremities for frostbite. Bill Mackenzie knelt beside his nephew, his weathered face showing the first real fear Katrin had seen in the old rancher. "His fingers," Ingrid said, examining David's hands. "Early-stage frostbite on 3 fingers. We caught it in time, but he needs gradual warming. No direct heat." She looked up at Katrin. "You saved his life. Another 10 minutes out there and he would have been gone." Bill Mackenzie turned to Katrin and she saw something shift in his expression. Until this moment, she realized, they had all been maintaining careful distance. The Americans had been kind but cautious. The Germans had been grateful but guarded. Everyone had been aware of the labels they wore: prisoner, captor, enemy, ally. "Thank you," Bill said simply, and those two words carried the weight of something larger than gratitude. Katrin felt her own walls crack slightly. "In Stuttgart," she said, speaking to Ingrid but including Bill in the conversation, "I have a brother, same age as your nephew. I think if he was lost in snow, I would want someone to find him. Not German, not American, just someone." The blizzard continued through the night and into the next day. The crowded mess hall became a strange, suspended world where normal rules and hierarchies melted away like snow near the fire. Women took turns feeding the sagebrush stove, the rhythm of the work creating a kind of meditation. Bill taught them songs from his Scottish childhood. Elsa Wagner shared a Christmas carol from her grandmother's village. Someone produced a deck of cards, and Guard Sergeant Mitchell taught the German women how to play poker, using buttons as currency. David recovered slowly, his fingers bandaged and elevated. He caught Katrin's eye across the crowded room and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no translation. Helene sat nearby, helping Ingrid change his bandages, her nervousness replaced by gentle competence. The blizzard broke on the third day, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and diamond-bright sunshine. The camp emerged from the mess hall into a world that felt newly made, silent except for the crunch of boots on snow. But the return to normal routines brought with it the mail delivery that had been delayed by the storm. Major Hayes called the German women together that afternoon. He held a canvas bag containing letters that had finally made their way through military channels from occupied Germany. The process of mail delivery to prisoners of war was complicated and slow, filtered through Red Cross offices and military censors. Some women had been waiting months for word from home. Katrin stood with Ingrid and Helene as Major Hayes read names from envelopes. Elsa Wagner. Elsa stepped forward, her hands trembling as she accepted the thin envelope. Marguerite Schmidt. Another woman moved to collect her letter. The process continued, each name called bringing a mixture of hope and dread to the recipient's face. When Katrin's name wasn't called, she felt the absence like a physical weight. No letter meant no news, which could mean anything. Her parents might have moved, the letter might have been lost in transit, or worse possibilities she didn't want to consider. Dresden had been heavily bombed. The rumors had been persistent and terrible. Ingrid's name also went uncalled. She stood rigid beside Katrin, her jaw set in that determined way she had when fighting to maintain composure. Helene received a letter, but when she opened it and read the single page inside, her face crumpled. Katrin moved to her side instantly, taking the letter as Helene's hands began to shake too badly to hold it. The letter was from a neighbor in Cologne, not family. It explained that Helene's mother and father had been killed during an air raid in November. Her younger sister was living with an aunt in Bavaria. The house where Helene had grown up was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. That evening, the women who had received letters gathered in small groups, some reading their news aloud, others keeping their correspondence private. The contents were universally grim. Cities destroyed. Food shortages approaching starvation levels. Family members dead, missing, or displaced. The Germany they had left behind no longer existed in any recognizable form. Katrin sat with Helene in their barracks, the younger woman's grief finally exhausting itself into silence. Through the window, she could see Bill Mackenzie and David outside, teaching a group of German women how to build a more efficient sagebrush fire using a method that would burn slower and require less frequent feeding. David's bandaged fingers didn't stop him from demonstrating the technique, his movements patient and clear. "What are we going back to?" Helene whispered, her voice raw. "My family is gone. My home is rubble. I don't even know if my sister remembers me. I've been gone so long." Katrine had no answer. She had been asking herself the same question since the blizzard, since the moment she pulled David from the snow and realized that enemies were just people, that borders and flags and propaganda dissolved in the face of simple human need. The Germany she had served, the Germany she had believed in, had been revealed as something monstrous, and the Germany that remained was a landscape of ruins and grief. Outside, the sound of laughter drifted through the cold air. Someone had made a joke in broken English. Someone else responded in equally broken German. The sound felt like a betrayal and a lifeline at the same time. Spring arrived slowly in the Colorado mountains, melting the snow in reluctant stages that revealed the brown earth beneath. By late March of 1945, the camp no longer needed constant sagebrush fires. The coal trucks had resumed their deliveries, though less frequently than before. The crisis had passed, but something fundamental had changed in the months between January and April. Major Hayes received official notification in early April. Germany's defeat was imminent. Repatriation procedures for all prisoners of war would begin immediately following the formal surrender. The German women at Camp Carson would be processed for return to Europe within 6 to 8 weeks. The announcement should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, it brought a complicated silence. Katrin stood with the other women in the mess hall, the same building where they had sheltered during the blizzard, and felt a tightness in her chest that she couldn't name. Return to what? To whom? That evening, Bill Mackenzie appeared at the camp gates. He had been coming regularly since the storm, bringing supplies, teaching additional survival skills, and simply spending time with the women he had helped save. David accompanied him, his frostbitten fingers now fully healed. Charlie Brennan came too, driving his own truck loaded with fresh vegetables from a greenhouse operation his family maintained. Heard about the repatriation orders, Bill said to Major Hayes, standing in the commandant's office. Figured I should say something before it's too late. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Some of these women, they don't have anything to go back to. Lost their families, their homes. Been thinking maybe some of them might want to stay, if that were possible. Major Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying the old rancher. That's a complicated proposition, Mr. Mackenzie. They're enemy nationals, prisoners of war. Immigration law doesn't exactly have a provision for captured soldiers who decide they'd prefer not to go home. Laws can be changed, Bill said stubbornly. Or at least bent when circumstances warrant. These women aren't enemies anymore. Hell, they never really were. They were just caught up in something bigger than they understood. And some of them, he met the Major's eyes directly, some of them saved my nephew's life. That counts for something in my book. Major Hayes was quiet for a long moment. If I were to explore this possibility, I would need specific requests from specific prisoners. And I would need American citizens willing to sponsor them, provide housing and employment, vouch for their character. It would be unprecedented. I'll sponsor them, Bill said immediately. I've got a ranch that could use extra hands. My sister Sarah has that big house in town, mostly empty since her husband passed. She's already said she'd be willing to help. Charlie Brennan's family has property too. We've talked about it. The conversation marked the beginning of something that would take weeks to navigate. Major Hayes sent inquiries up the chain of command. Bill Mackenzie began organizing local families willing to participate in sponsorship, and the German women themselves faced the most difficult decision of their lives. Katrin sat in the barracks with Ingrid and Helene, the same conversation happening in a dozen different clusters throughout the camp. 20 years later, in the spring of 1965, Katrin Mackenzie stood in her kitchen in Colorado, teaching her teenage daughter how to identify sagebrush through the window. The girl, born in America but named Margarete after Katrin's mother, listened with the patient tolerance of a child, humoring a parent's nostalgia. "Mom, we have central heating now," Margarete said in English, the only language she spoke fluently despite her mother's attempts to teach her German. "Why do I need to know about burning sagebrush?" Katrin smiled, her accent still present after 2 decades but softened around the edges. "Because knowing how to survive makes you free. Your grandfather Bill taught me that." She had married David Mackenzie in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. The wedding had been small, held at the ranch with Major Hayes in attendance, along with Ingrid and Helene and the 6 other German women who had chosen to stay. Charlie Brennan had been David's best man, and Sarah Mackenzie had cried through the entire ceremony. Ingrid had become a nurse at the hospital in Colorado Springs, eventually marrying a doctor there. She visited often, bringing her 2 sons who played with Catherine's children and spoke no German at all. Helene had married Charlie Brennan, a match that surprised no one who had watched them during those cold winter months. They ran a successful cattle operation north of the Mackenzie Ranch. Of the 9 women who had originally chosen to stay, 8 remained in Colorado. One had eventually returned to Germany in 1952 to care for an elderly aunt, but she wrote long letters describing how strange her homeland felt after years in America, how she missed the vast spaces and the scent of sagebrush smoke. The Germany they had left behind had been rebuilt, transformed into something unrecognizable from the country that had sent them to war. Catherine had visited once, in 1958, and found Dresden restored, but different, its Baroque beauty replaced with modern efficiency. Her brother, who had survived the war, barely recognized her. She had become too American, he said, not quite accusingly, but not quite accepting either. She had returned to Colorado with relief, realizing that Bill Mackenzie had been right all those years ago. Home wasn't where you came from. It was where you chose to build a life that honored the best in human nature rather than the worst. Bill had passed away the previous winter at 81 years old, still ranching until the final month. At his funeral, Catherine had spoken about the day he first appeared at Camp Carson, with his weathered face and his knowledge of sagebrush, offering survival to women who had been his enemies. She told the gathered mourners that he had taught her more than how to burn desert plants for warmth. He had taught her that kindness was a choice, that redemption was possible, and that the labels people wore, prisoner or free, enemy or friend, mattered less than what they chose to do in moments when no one was watching. Every winter, Catherine still burned sagebrush in a fire pit behind the house, not because she needed to, but because the sharp, clean scent reminded her of the moment she stopped being a prisoner and started becoming herself.